Hello and welcome to On the Line. I'm Karl Richter. Texas Democrat Beto O'Rourke is back on the campaign trail, this time challenging incumbent Republican Governor Greg Abbott. The election is almost a year away, but O'Rourke has already begun traveling around the state, stumping in cities large and small. It's a strategy that brought him within 3 percentage points of Republican Senator Ted Cruz in the 2018 race that first put O'Rourke in the national political spotlight. He followed that run with a bid for the Democratic presidential nomination. Earlier this year, he again hit the road in Texas in support of voting rights and registration. On Saturday, O'Rourke visited Texarkana, drawing a small but seemingly receptive audience to hear his message. After that appearance, he stopped by the studio for a half-hour interview. I asked him about a range of issues, including COVID mandates, abortion, and gun regulation. Here's my conversation with candidate for governor, Beto O'Rourke. Welcome to Texarkana.
It's great to be back here. We've been here so many times before, but struck by how every time we come, folks are so nice and kind and welcoming to us. And I know it's not a place that you typically expect to find Democratic candidates traveling to, but Democrats do a little bit better each single election cycle, and we can continue that and in fact increase it if we keep showing up. You got to show up for people. So anyhow, I'm glad to be here.
You're moving on to Paris after this, correct?
We're going back to Paris after this. Yesterday we were in Marshall and Nacogdoches, and the day before we were in Beaumont. And so really East Texas almost from end to end, and then moving into kind of the northeast part of Texas.
Well, a lot to get to before you have to get back on the road, so I just want to jump right in on some issues. You've been focused on voting rights and voter registration lately. I wanted to ask you specifically about gerrymandering. Just this week, the Department of Justice sued the state of Texas, claiming that the new redistricting is discriminatory. How concerned are you about gerrymandering, and what would be your ideal system for redistricting?
I think it should concern all of us, whether we're Democrats, Republicans, independents. As long as we're Americans and we believe in democracy, it should be one person, one vote. And what we decided as a country in 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act is that we were not going to allow anyone from being prevented from exercising their full small d democratic power, their ability to cast a ballot and affect the outcome of an election. But when you have members of Congress and members of the state legislature choosing their own voters instead of the other way around, then you've diminished the voting power of everyday Texans. And that diminishes Republican votes, it diminishes Democratic votes, and it helps to produce a situation whereby Texas has become one of the worst states when it comes to voter turnout. I mean, some years we rank 50th. I think right now we're 46th. And we are number one in terms of difficulty in being able to cast a ballot. And so you add all that up and you get to something that isn't living up to the full promise of American democracy. And so, I don't want the federal government suing the state of Texas. None of us in Texas should want that. And so Texas should get its act together and make sure that we draw fair districts that include everyone. And the best way to do that, and this is something that I hope appeals to all of us, regardless of party, is to have nonpartisan, non-political, citizen-led redistricting commissions. Let the people decide.
Moving on to the economy, Governor Abbott is running in large part on the strength of the state economy and the business environment. What do you see there when you look at that at the state's economy and the business environment, and what would you do differently? And how would border and immigration policy feed into that?
Look, we have by far the best state, the best people, the hardest working folks anywhere right here in Texas, and we should be number one. Today we're not, and there are a lot of reasons for that. In fact, last year we were 31st in job creation in the United States. We weren't even in the top half, and we should be number one. You've got more than 40% of Texans, 4 out of every 10 of us, are not making a living wage despite working so hard. So we're working second and third jobs. We're on public assistance. We're unable to keep a roof over our heads or feed our kids. That's not right. We have got to do better. And it begins with some leadership that creates a business-friendly environment, like keeping the lights on and the power grid running, making sure that we respond to public health crises with science and medical advice instead of, playing to the polls or the next primary election. And it means getting away from the extremist fringe agenda that defined this last legislative session from Governor Abbott, the reproductive health care ban that effectively outlawed abortion, but even worse, set a $10,000 bounty on the heads of Texas women choosing to make their own reproductive health care decisions. These permitless carry laws against the advice of police chiefs and sheriffs across the state that allows anyone, including criminals, violent criminals, at a time of rising crime in Texas, to carry a loaded handgun in public without any kind of background check. These are not business-friendly decisions, and it imperils our ability to be number one in job creation and to create high-paying jobs going forward. So let's get back to the basics of ensuring that we're focused on world-class jobs, wonderful public schools so that we're graduating kids who are competitive for those jobs, and then making common sense decisions like expanding Medicaid, which, if we would take yes for an answer, would have brought $100 billion with a B, $100 billion into Texas over the last 8 years and allowed us to hire more providers, get more people to see a doctor or fill a prescription, and reduce the property tax bill for homeowners and business owners as well, who right now foot the bill for uncompensated care in our hospitals. These are some real common sense decisions. And you asked about immigration and how it plays into this. Look, I'll listen to farmers and ranchers, folks who live on the border, folks who live away from the border, and everyone agrees we have to have rule of law. We have to have order where our country meets Mexico and the rest of the world. And we have to have some common sense immigration reforms like a guest worker program that ensures that people who want to come to this country, work an honest day, and then return back to their home country and not stay here and become citizens are able to do that. Or that there is some predictability in the line that people wait to come here and do this the right way. Right now, they're waiting in line 20 years, and it's an incentive for people to jump in front of the line or to break the law. We don't want to do that either. So Republicans and Democrats can come together and make some common sense and find some common ground and do something good for Texas that will, by the way, be good for our economy.
Speaking of common ground, I wonder if you see any on gun regulation. I think probably for better or worse, a lot of voters know you best for the stand you staked out during your presidential bid, including advocating for a mandatory buyback of certain weapons. Do you still advocate for that? What sort of gun regulations would you like to see in place?
Here's what I advocate for. We should protect the Second Amendment. Like most Texans, I grew up in a home with firearms. I grew up learning both how to use those firearms and how to use them and own them responsibly. Like most Texans, I want to make sure that those firearms are not used against those with whom we live, whether in our schools, in our supermarkets, in our movie theaters, in our churches. We can do both. We're Texas. We can figure this out. We can make sure that we have common sense gun policies that protect the rights of hunters and gun owners and veterans and others who own firearms and use them responsibly, while making sure that we no longer have the kinds of mass shootings. And we have 4 of the deadliest mass shootings that have taken place in this country just here in Texas in the last 5 years. And that we don't have the daily shootings that take place in our communities, like the one that took place in Texarkana around Halloween that so many people are still talking about right now. And so here's some ideas. What if we had universal background checks? Gun owners, non-gun owners alike seem to think that that's a pretty good idea. Or what if we did not do, as the governor did, sign a bill into law that allows any violent criminal to carry a loaded firearm in public? That makes it more likely that we'll have violent crime in Texas. And when I listen to firearms instructors, for example, in my hometown of El Paso, who may or may not agree with me on every position I've taken when it comes to gun policy, they'll say what Governor Abbott is doing right now is so extreme and on the fringe and makes it so hard for us to make sure that we're going to keep our communities and our streets safe. This one Vietnam veteran that I know who's a firearms instructor in El Paso said, when I used to do the firearms training for people applying for a license to carry permit, there would be people who come in who didn't know which end of the gun the bullet fired out of. And now these people, without any training or background check, are going to be on our streets. And that really worries me, he said. So I'm listening to the people of Texas. There's common ground on these issues. We just need to find it and move forward on it.
You touched on the new state abortion law, which the Supreme Court just let stand just yesterday as we're recording this. Can you just lay out for people what your position is on abortion? It's very important to our listeners here.
I trust women to make their own decisions about their own bodies, about their own health care, about their own future. And it's very clear that the governor does not trust Texas women. I mean, he may say that he is pro-life. I think the record would argue the opposite. You look at Child Protective Services, for example, where kids are sleeping on the desks and in the hallways because the governor has failed to focus on keeping those kids safe and in some cases keeping them alive. You look at the power grid failure where more than 700 Texans died, including an 11-year-old boy who literally froze to death in his bed in Conroe, Texas. You look at the deplorable state of so many of our schools across this state of Texas right now, and it leads me to the conclusion that his position is not about pro-life. It is about controlling women and not trusting them and making their own decisions. And this happens at a time that Texas is at the epicenter of a maternal mortality crisis. We're losing Texas women at a frightening rate right now, and especially women of color. Black women are 3 times more likely to die than white women in this state who are already at record levels of maternal mortality. So when you can't go to a reproductive health care clinic, not only can you not get an abortion, but you may not be able to get a cervical cancer screening or reproductive health care help or see a doctor at all in the least insured state in the country. So this is literally a matter of life and death, and it has made it far more dangerous to be a woman in the state of Texas, especially when any American can seek to cash in on a $10,000 bounty, which is part of this anti-reproductive health care bill that Greg Abbott signed into law. It is the most extreme fringe piece of legislation signed into law in this country this year.
If you are elected, you're likely to have to work with a Republican legislature. So what sort of remedy do you foresee as possible regarding abortion?
I served for 6 years in Congress, and every day of that time I was in the minority, and every year of my service I was on the House Veterans Affairs Committee. And the only way to deliver for those veterans that I represented back home in Texas was to find some common ground with my Republican colleagues who were in the majority. And so when I would author a bill, I wouldn't author it for the choir, for my fellow Democrats. I would author it for consensus so that we could get it passed and signed into law, including signed into law by Donald Trump. There's a guy that I agree with on almost nothing, but we could find enough common ground and common sense to get veterans legislation passed to improve the lives and outcomes for those who had served this country. I think we can find that same common ground on the issue of reproductive health care when we begin with the understanding that Texas now leads the country in teen pregnancy and the rate of repeat teen pregnancy. When we remind people about those maternal mortality statistics and the women that we're losing in this state, I think we're going to find some consensus around at least making sure that women have access to health care. We might even find some compromise around ensuring that people can make their own decisions about their own body. And we might even recognize that Texans who are pro-life, who are pro-choice, want to make sure that we're treating one another with the respect and dignity that we deserve. And I hope out of a conversation like that, we can do something far better than where we are today. But I'll tell you, the reason that you hear me talking so much about jobs, so much about great schools, so much about expanding Medicaid, is those are three issues that Republicans and Democrats alike can agree on in almost every instance. And I recognize that after this election is over, if I'm governor, I'm very likely to be working with the Republican majority legislature. And so we've got to set everyone's expectations that we might not all and each get to do everything that we want or achieve our version of the ideal. But if we can ensure that the perfect does not become the enemy of the good and get focused on jobs and schools and seeing a doctor, I know we can get it done and we can get back to doing the big things in Texas again.
Subscribe today to the Texarkana Gazette and you'll get an Apple iPad to use at no charge, plus a Sunday paper delivered to your home. Every day you'll get an electronic version of the Gazette downloaded directly to your iPad. It's the ultimate home delivery. No more waiting, wet papers, or going out into the cold. And everything you want, the latest news, puzzles, and coupons, is right there. You can zoom in to make articles easier to read, or have the iPad read them to you aloud. Enjoy full-color photo galleries and embedded video content, and access the Gazette's archives back to 2002. For only $29.99 a month, it's a great deal. Call 870-648-1209. That's 870-648-1209 to subscribe to the Texarkana Gazette today. One of your headline messages, and you've brought it up once or twice already today, is the power grid and protecting it against the sort of thing that happened in February. Is that sort of catastrophe preventable without a big spike in consumer energy prices?
Yes. It would have helped if the governor, after warnings in 2011 and 2014, when we had similar challenges with the grid, had followed the advice of the people of Texas and invested in weatherizing the grid and requiring those who control the gas supply in this state, which is the single greatest contributing factor to the outages that we saw in February, get them to invest in the weatherization of their part of the system. But he didn't. But what made it even worse is that even after 700 died, even after millions went without power, even after this state sustained tens of billions of dollars in damage, the governor, despite not just one legislative session, but a number of special sessions, did nothing to protect the people of this state and added insult to injury by requiring all of us to pay more on every single utility bill going forward for the next 2 decades. This is an Abbott tax. It's a 15% increase on your electric bill, on your heating bill, for many on their water bill, that you will pay for the foreseeable future to clean up the mess that he and those that he was doing the bidding of created in the first place. Why hasn't he taken the necessary steps? Within a month of the power grid failure, one person whose company made $2.4 billion on the disaster wrote Greg Abbott a $1 million campaign contribution check. So he is beholden to these campaign contributors, and he's not going to do anything to upset the money train coming into his campaign. But what that does is it leaves us vulnerable in the case we have more extreme weather next year or in years to come. So what do? We require those gas supply companies to invest in their part of the grid. We connect ERCOT to the national grid so that we can draw down power in the event that we need it. We invest in weatherization and energy efficiency so that we require less power going forward. And then we cap the cost or the price of gas. And as you know, it skyrocketed in February. And that's how people made billions of dollars on the misery and suffering of others. No one should be profiting on the pain of the people of Texas. And so those 4 steps would weatherize the grid, prevent another disaster like this, and keep the ratepayer, the average Texan, from footing the bill at the end of the day.
I want to get back to voting rights. When you were here in June, you made it clear you think that we're facing a threat to democracy itself right now. What threats do you see? What are the solutions you see?
I'm really concerned that we have now made Texas the toughest state in which to vote. No online voter registration, no automatic voter registration for U.S. citizens turning 18. We've closed down more than 700 polling places over the last 10 years, more than any other state by a Texas mile. And we are forcing more Texans to have to go further and wait longer in order to cast a ballot, and making it tough to register, making it tough to prove your identity at the ballot box, or if you want to vote by mail. And it seems to be uniquely targeted at those with disabilities, at young voters, at black and brown voters across the state of Texas. And you see that reflected in some of what you've read from the Department of Justice so far this year. And that concerns me not as a Democrat. I mean, it certainly makes it harder for Democrats because so much of this suppression is targeted at preventing Democrats from being successful in elections. What it really concerns me about is the future and fate of American democracy. You know, when we were at this meeting just now in Texarkana, a lot of veterans were there. And I'm reminded that when they enlisted, they swore an oath not to the president, not to a political party, not to any one person, but to our Constitution and to our form of government, this democracy where we get to freely choose those who will represent us and the direction that this country will take. And that is imperiled in this country right now, and nowhere more so than the state of Texas. So I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat, or if you're going to vote for a Republican or a Democrat. If you're eligible, there should be no obstacle in your way in order to do that. And the other thing that really concerns me is this effort, and I know you saw this in the regular legislative session this year. There was a proposal made and initially passed and then later retracted that would have allowed the state of Texas to overturn lawfully, legitimately, small d, democratically decided elections on the allegation of fraud and fraud alone, or on that allegation alone. And that's exactly what we almost faced in 2020 when the former president tried to get different state election boards to overturn legitimately decided elections. It worries me that, 245 years into this experiment that is really the exception and not the rule in world history, we might very well lose our ability to freely decide the outcome of these contests. And so that one's on all of us. Abraham Lincoln reminded us this is government of, by, and for the people. We can't just blame it on the people in power. It's up to all of us to make this right. And so whether you're running for office, whether you're voting, whether you're volunteering, whether you're showing up to testify at Senate and House hearings on these issues, all of us have to do our part to defend this democracy and make sure that we come through.
Along the same lines, politics is more polarized now than ever before. Who is the persuadable voter in Texas? Who is it that hasn't already made up their mind that you're really trying to reach?
It's interesting. There were more than 7 million eligible Texas voters last year in the most important presidential contest since 1864 who did not cast a ballot. 7 million who could have voted and didn't vote. They don't need to be persuaded to vote for a Democrat because they're Republicans, or for Republicans because they're Democrats. They just need to be persuaded to vote at all. And they are all over this state in each one of the 254 counties. So the number one reason given by non-voters for not voting is that no one ever asked them to vote. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to go out and reach them, knock on their doors literally, and give them a reason to vote, to talk about the kind of jobs they want to work, the kind of schools they want for their kids, the ability to be healthy and well enough because they can now see a doctor if we expand Medicaid. I think that's a huge persuadable universe right there. And then when it comes to Republicans and Democrats, after the power grid failure, the 74,000 killed by COVID, many unnecessarily, after these anti-mask mandates that prevented teachers from protecting the kids in their care, and made Texas #1 in COVID childhood mortality. After this extremist agenda that we saw from the governor this year on you name an issue and the culture wars he wants us fighting instead of the big stuff we want to be doing, I think there are some Republicans who are open to an alternative. And I want to make sure that they are welcomed into this campaign and that we write nobody off and that we make it very clear. I want to serve everyone in Texas, and the differences aren't going to define us or keep us from coming together.
You brought up COVID. Would you, if you were elected during this pandemic or any future pandemic, mandate vaccinations for people you could, say, state employees?
Here's what I would not do, which is what we're seeing from the governor right now. I would not stand in the way of local governments or business owners doing what they thought was most important to protect those in their care, or in the case of an entrepreneur, their employees and their customers. You asked about political openings with Republicans or persuadable voters. There are a lot of really upset, frustrated business owners who thought that we were a free market capitalist state and society, and now have the governor telling them that they cannot protect their employees or their customers. You have school board trustees in Paris, Texas, in Lamar County that went 80% for Donald Trump, who are frustrated the governor will not allow them to protect the children in their care, and had to go so far as requiring masks as part of the dress code to get under or away from the governor's anti-mask mandate. So look, I trust Texas, and I trust local leaders, and I trust the people of this state to do the right thing. And the least the governor should be able to do is to get out of the way when those who are closest to the people they want to serve and care for are trying to do the right thing.
But what about an executive level mandate? Is that something that you could see yourself doing?
I don't think we need to do that. I really don't in Texas. I think that people want to do the right thing. I think we have to be understanding of and listening to one another. Cynthia and I were in Beaumont. Cynthia, who runs the road part of our campaign, we were in we were in Galveston. It was Galveston, and a woman stood in line after my talk, and she stood in line for an hour, and wanted to take a picture, wanted to introduce me to her family and her kids that she homeschools. And she says, you know what, we have not gotten the vaccine. And I want to tell you why, from my perspective, that it's so important that we don't do this. And I listened to her, and I could kind of understand from her perspective why she had made this decision. And it ended up being a longer conversation than we were going to be able to have in that line. But it reminded me that we've got to listen to one another. And when we push people in a corner, when we judge them, when we write them off, when we try to force something without explaining what it is we're trying to do, we end up alienating one another and losing that chance to connect. And I know from meeting that woman, she wants to do the right thing by her kids. She wants to do the right thing for Galveston. She wants to do the right thing for her community. And so let's listen to one another, and let's have some patience, and let's find a way to bring people in to the right solution. So that's the way that I want to approach this.
What are you hearing out on the campaign trail? What are people most concerned about?
It's interesting. Right at the top, we talked about how important jobs, great public schools, the ability to see a doctor if we expand Medicaid are. And those weren't ideas or issues that were cooked up in a focus group or through a poll, because I haven't done either of those things. It's just a reflection of what I'm hearing across the state. So you go to South Texas, where a lot of ink has been spilled about, can Democrats do better than they did in 2020 in South Texas and the Rio Grande Valley? And what I know from living on the border myself is that so often national Democrats reduce the border to the issue of immigration, and they'll talk to Mexican American or Hispanic voters only about immigration, and only as though immigration is universally a good thing no matter what. And what I found by listening to people on the border is that they really care about jobs. These are some of the poorest urban counties in America. People are literally not making a living wage. They cannot get by. Their kids are hungry. They want to make sure that they can work, and when they work, that they can get paid. They really care about health care in places where you have frightening levels of diabetes and heart disease, and people who are passing away way too early because they never got to see a doctor. And then perhaps most important of all, they really care about schools, and they care about schools for their kids. They care about schools for the educators, the counselors, the librarians, the school teachers in their lives who are really struggling to get by as well and are very often working a second or a third job just to make ends meet. So that's what I'm hearing around the state. And, I'm going everywhere, as you know, and we're listening to everybody. And whether it's here in East Texas or, tomorrow and later on in the week when we're in Midland and Lubbock and Amarillo, or when we go to some of the bigger cities like Dallas and San Antonio, El Paso, my hometown, and Houston, jobs, schools, the ability to see a doctor. And what I love about that is that you will not find the Republican who will disagree that those should be our priorities. You won't find the Democrat who disagrees that we should be focused on those things. So after so much division and polarization and tearing each other apart and going after each other in the most vicious ways, let's find some things that we actually agree on and come together as a state. And I think that's how we do it.
Speaking of going everywhere, I know you're on a tight schedule, and that's about all of our time. We could talk for a lot longer, I'm sure. Thanks very much for stopping by, and safe travels.
It's a pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Sure. There will be lots of debate over the next year.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you so much.
On the Line is a Texarkana Gazette podcast recorded in Star Bear Studio, right here in downtown Texarkana, USA. The show was written, produced, and edited by Karl Richter. News stories are based on Gazette staff reports. Texarkana Gazette podcasts are made possible in part by a grant from the Google News Initiative Journalism Emergency Relief Fund. I'll see you next week on The Line.